The River Between Us, Chapter 15, by Richard Peck. Read for you by Mrs. Shoemaker. Time and the Mississippi River. It was that summer of 1916 when my dad took me and my little brothers down home to see his folks. Time has a different shape in Grand Tower, Illinois. And so when we got there, Dad was young Bill, and we were young Bill's boys. Summer afternoons are longer in southern Illinois than anywhere else, and hotter. The sun hangs eternally just off-center in the blinding sky. Dad spent the afternoons mostly up in Great Aunt Delphine's room. He sat at her bedside by the window that looks out across the river to where the wedding party drowned long ago. As one afternoon folded into the next, I began to see this was another reason for our visit. His Aunt Delphine was dying. Would she become another Grand Tower haunt, like the ghost woman with the flying gray hair who darted across the road and into the Mississippi? Like that ghost who grieved the loss of a son, though he was still alive? My little brothers, Raymond and Earl, trailed great Uncle Noah on all his afternoon chores. They'd never seen a one-armed man before, and this one could do what other people needed both hands for. He could peel an apple, kill a rat, bait a hook, all kinds of things deeply interesting to 5-year-old boys. They had no idea he was entertaining them. They thought he was just going about his business. The only one of us who napped was old Doc Hutchings. He sat in his porch rocker, transparent with age, courteous even in drooping sleep. He had the dignity I saw in my dad. His clean white hands were folded neatly in his lap. These were the hands that had amputated Noah's arm in the first year of the war after the Battle of Belmont. And how many more arms and legs, how many thousands through all the blood-slick years of war? I knew the story because Grandma Tilly told me. She was a talker when she got going, and could bring it all back for you. I saw for myself the amputated arms sinking in the churning river as they brought the wounded back to Cairo. I still see it. Neither age nor the weather slowed Grandma Tilly. She was a whirlwind from early morning on, cooking and baking for extra mouths. She was up and down the stairs, fetching and carrying for Aunt Delphine, and not letting anyone else do it. Carrying her slops, too, because there was no plumbing in the house. But she found a corner of every afternoon to round me up and lead me to the crest of the Devil's Backbone, to a flat rock they called the Devil's Footstool, just among themselves. It had airplane views out over the river and Tower Rock. There we sat, both of us barefoot, while she brought back the old times for me. She handed over the past like a parcel, seizing these days to do it. She couldn't sit there idle, of course. She didn't know how to be idle. She brought an old sewing basket with pearls and little shells on the lid, and her mending. She darned over a milk glass egg and spun out her yarns. At first, I didn't know how to listen to tales that old. But we began to edge across the years toward each other, Grandma Tilly and I. I began to see the yellow lamplight on their faces, just a flicker at first. I heard the calliope music wavering over the water. At every turn the story took, I remembered I was just about the age now they were then. Except for Cass. She was younger. What happened to Cass? Oh, she's down there. Grandma Tilly pointed a bent finger to a long dip between the backbone and another outcropping called Oven Rock. It looked like overgrown wilderness. It was a graveyard, but they didn't keep it up. And by then I knew how she worked to keep the sentiment out of her voice. Still, it was about to break through. She died young? Well, she died the year after the war, 1866. She was 17. Dr. Hutchings called it diphtheria. She always spoke of him as Dr. Hutchings. She addressed him as Dr. Hutchings. If it hadn't been diphtheria, it would have been something else. I washed her poor bird body and dressed her in the sprigged dimity she wore that night of the showboat. I put her in the coffin and wouldn't let nobody near her. I held her in my arms one last time, and then I let her go again. She gave up on life after Calinda left us. I waited for more, and then said, "Why did Calinda leave?" Well, she was too dark to stay, wasn't she? She couldn't pass. I always thought she was the color of honey at the bottom of the jar. I expect she thought people would put two and two together, and they would give Delphine away. You know how there were always rumors about them. No, she had it in her mind to go out to California. She said out there she'd be light enough to be Spanish, and she was good with money. She always had some put by for the journey. She was a true bird of passage, always ready to take flight. Grandma Tilly looked out across the river to the west. A hard journey in them days, before there was a train to take you all the way to California. We knew she'd go, and I was scared Cass would go with her. I thought the trip might kill her. But of course, staying behind is what finally done her in. Calinda was what they call a conjure woman down yonder in New Orleans. She could tell your fortune, you know, and there'd be a market for that in the more built-up areas. Cass had the gift, too. That's what drawed them together, closer than sisters. But I suppose it was too late for Cass. I think she'd been worn out by her visions before Calinda came among us. A hot breeze stirred the trees. We never heard tell of Calinda again. I expect she prospered. She had all those talents, didn't she? But we never heard. They had a brother, too, 'member, in Paris, France. But they were the free people of color, and after the war they had to find new selves. I suppose it was just better to cut their ties and go it alone. Think how many more there must be like them, perched very quiet up on people's family trees, safe now from being called ugly names. That was the last afternoon of our visit. It had taken Grandma Tilly the week to tell her story. She bit off the thread. She didn't have all her teeth, not nearly all. And then she stole another look at where the graveyard had been, down where Cass was. "And your pa?" I said. "He's down there?" "Yes, he's down there. We didn't bury Cass next to him. There wasn't any point to that. And, of course, Mama's not there." Grandma Tilly turned away from me. "Mama went in the river." It was time to leave then, and somehow I wasn't ready. We climbed up off our rock, the Devil's Footstool, for the last time. Grandma Tilly had to look way up at me. I was getting to be what she called a big, tall galoot. We started down the backbone to the house. "They never did get married, you know," she said, almost offhanded. "You're old enough to hear it." "Who didn't?" "Delphine and Noah." "They never got married? But—" "Oh, we put it around that they got married. We said they went up to Centralia or somewhere to tie the knot. I forget now where we said they went. But they never did. It like to break Noah's heart. But Delphine wouldn't have it. She said her kind didn't marry white men. And she was passing for white. She said it would betray all her traditions. Said her mother, her maman, would turn over in her grave. Her mother died during the war, when New Orleans was occupied by our troops. We got that word. But anyway, Delphine never would marry Noah, though they're more married than most. But you know how she is. If she makes up her mind to something or lapses into that French language, you just as well get out of her road. She make a mule look agreeable. I remember one more thing Grandma Tilly told me. She said that time was like the Mississippi River. It only flows in one direction. And she meant you could never go back. But of course we had. She'd taken me back. We went on down to the house. She had a way of telling you so much, you thought you'd heard it all. And I knew where she'd learned that. The night before we left Grand Tower, Great Uncle Noah wrung the neck off a fat fryer, to my little brother's great excitement, and Grandma Tilly fried it in batter for our picnic hamper. She loaded us down with deviled eggs and buttermilk biscuits. She piled us high with jars of her rhubarb preserves and looked around and around herself to see what else we ought to have. We filled our bottles from their well. Dad personally filed down the points on the spark plugs, and we made an early start the next day. The three old folks were on the porch to see us go. We'd say our goodbyes to Great Aunt Delphine the night before, up in her cluttered room under the portrait of her yellow-haired father. She couldn't speak, but those great fringed violet eyes ate us alive. The touch of her little pillowed hand lingered on mine long after. We left in the cool of the morning. Being parked on the backbone helped because the Ford started better on a slant. I got the engine to catch after no more than 5 minutes. We settled the little boys, brown as berries now, on the back seat. And then, in this miraculous morning, Dad climbed up into the heaving car on the passenger's side. He was letting me drive. My heart sang. I was to drive, and let out the brake and fiddled with the gas lever so that Dad could turn back and wave to them up on the porch. He waved until the house and then the hill and then the town were swallowed in our dust. We made good time going home, keeping the river on our left, retracing our route, though we had more flats. Raymond and Earl wanted to stop the night and make our camp where we had before. They wanted this trip to have an exact shape. Dad pretty well convinced them that we'd found our original campground when it was time to pull off that evening, though we never found a trace of the old campfire. We built another one and ate better that night than weenies on a stick. After the dust of the day, there were circles around our eyes where the goggles had been. The twins were nodding off against each other before the dying fire, and I sat next to Dad on the running board. As if he'd waited for this moment, he said, "I've been thinking of getting into the war if the country does." It shook me. Then I saw this was another reason for the trip.
"You'll think I'm too old for a soldier," he said. "And maybe I am, but they'll need doctors. I didn't want to spring it on you at the last minute. You'd have to take over at home till I get back. Be there for your mother and the boys."
In the quiet, I heard my dad waiting. He wanted it to be all right with me. He wanted my approval. Nothing this grown up had happened to me before. This was something Grandma Tilly couldn't understand. How war promises a boy it can make a man out of him. "Well, your dad went to war, didn't he?" I said.
"Yes, he did."
"They can't fight a war without a doc—" "My father isn't Dr. Hutchings," Dad said. "Noah's my father." I grabbed hold of the running board. The night revolved around me. "And Delphine's my mother. She's slipping away. And I wanted this time with her. We couldn't be mother and son, you see. She didn't trust the world. She didn't trust the town. She never knew when somebody would see her for who she was and turn on her. She wouldn't hand that on to me. It could have closed too many doors in my face. So I was named for Dr. William Hutchings. They had no other children, the doctor and your Grandma Tilly. None of their own. So I was their son too. And as you said, I had 4 parents. He didn't mention love. It wasn't a word they used. But there was plenty they didn't mention. "I'm proud of every drop of blood in me," Dad said, quiet to keep from waking the boys. "And one day, when you've had time to think it over, I hope you'll be proud too." I remember Grandma Tilly speaking of the blood hurrying through her veins. And now I felt the blood hurry through mine, flowing like the Mississippi River, as my dad and I sat there on the running board under a sky crowded with stars. I didn't have to think it over. I was proud of anything that made me his son. I was proud of being Noah's grandson and Delphine's grandson. I was older now too, a lot older than when this trip began. Older and looking ahead. One day, I'd tell a son of my own this story of who we were, a son or a daughter with enormous violet eyes.